Jerry worked in the third-floor office of a dull insurance company. He was in his mid-40s, a loud and overly chatty guy who thrived on being the center of attention. His jokes weren't funny, his stories were long and boring, but he had a way of making up for it by being generous, bringing in donuts, buying around at happy hour, remembering everyone's birthday. Most people liked him even if they had to endure his ceaseless talking. One Monday morning, Jerry leaned against the edge of his cubicle, telling his usual rambling story about a fishing trip he had over the weekend. His voice boomed across the open office, and a few of his co-workers chuckled politely. That's when a black fly, buzzing lazily by the coffee maker, darted straight into Jerry's open mouth. He coughed, then laughed it off, making a spectacle of fake gagging and swallowing, eyes wide as if the fly had been a grand punchline. "Guess he liked my story," he said, forcing out a hearty laugh that nobody joined. He carried on with his day as if nothing had happened, but something had shifted, though nobody could have known just how much. By Tuesday, Jerry seemed off. He was quieter, more irritable, snapping at minor inconveniences. The bags under his eyes were deeper than usual, his face paler. The cheerful, dopey grin was replaced by a scowl, the friendly banter reduced to mumbled complaints. People noticed, but chalked it up to the flu or a bad night's sleep. Wednesday, things got worse. Jerry's skin looked different, grayish, almost translucent, with veins that seemed a little too visible. His voice, usually loud and boisterous, was hoarse and strained, like he'd been screaming all night. He didn't laugh at his own jokes anymore. He barely talked at all, except for cryptic, bitter mutterings under his breath. He was colder to everyone, and when his co-workers tried to ask if he was okay, he just stared with eyes that were now disturbingly bloodshot, his pupils strangely wide. By Thursday, his appearance had taken a sharp downturn. He was thinner, his cheeks sunken in, his skin clammy and damp. He scratched at his arms constantly, as if something was crawling underneath. His breath reeked, foul and sour, and people avoided him when he came near. He barely spoke, just sat at his desk with a jittery, frantic energy, his eyes darting around like he was expecting something terrible to happen. He didn't bring donuts, didn't make jokes, didn't acknowledge anyone. Friday morning, Jerry showed up, but it hardly looked like him anymore. His hair was greasy, his clothes hung loose on his frame, and his eyes, bloodshot, wild, almost feverish, were sunken deep into his skull. The veins under his skin now stood out like dark blue lines etched beneath the surface. He kept licking his lips, murmuring to himself, his gaze unfocused and vacant. And then, around noon, it happened. Jerry stood up suddenly in the middle of the office, knocking his chair to the floor. Everyone froze and turned to him. He started to speak, his voice a low, guttural croak, but the words were jumbled, incoherent. He grabbed at his throat, his fingers digging into the loose, sagging flesh. His eyes rolled back, and a guttural, almost animalistic scream tore from his mouth. His face twisted with pain and something else, something that looked like pure, primal fear. Without warning, Jerry fell to his knees, coughing violently, hacking, as if he were trying to get something out. His back arched, his shoulders heaving. Then, with a final, horrible wrench, he spat out a mass, a writhing, black clump that hit the floor with a wet, sticky thud. It was a swarm of tiny black flies, bursting from his mouth like a cloud. Screams erupted from his co-workers as the swarm grew, the black mass of flies scattering through the office, buzzing in a frenzy. Jerry was on his hands and knees, gasping, choking, but there was something else emerging from him, thin, wiry legs pushing their way out from the corners of his mouth, stretching his jaw impossibly wide. He convulsed, his body jerking and twitching, eyes bulging as the thing crawled up his throat, forcing its way out. The lights flickered. A figure began to emerge, pulling itself free, a grotesque, spider-like creature with impossibly long limbs and a body that seemed to shimmer in and out of existence. Its legs were covered in ragged fur, its eyes cold and unblinking. It crawled over Jerry's collapsed body, twitching and shuddering, and the buzzing intensified. Jerry was still. His body was a withered, empty husk on the carpet, and the creature, the thing that had been inside him, scuttled up the nearest wall, vanishing into the dark corners of the ceiling. The buzzing flies began to dissipate, the echo of Jerry's final scream lingering in the air long after the lights had steadied. The office was silent, a stunned, horrified silence. No one moved, no one spoke. Jerry's cubicle, now eerily empty, felt like a gaping hole in the fabric of reality, a space where something unspeakable had been, and now was not. Weeks later, the office remained abandoned, the building locked. Whispers circulated about what really happened to Jerry, and why flies now clustered endlessly at the third-floor windows. The company relocated, but the stories never stopped. The sound of buzzing late at night, the faint shadow that sometimes moved along the edges of the glass, and a figure that, if you looked closely, was just watching. And if you stayed long enough, you could still hear Jerry's voice, low, desperate, and cracking with laughter, coming from somewhere deep inside the walls.